Hey everybody, my name is Patrick Spencer. I'm the VP of Marketing, Corporate Marketing and Research over at Kiteworks. We're thrilled to have you on today's webinar. I'll share my screen here so we can get started and introduce our fabulous guest. And get into presentation mode. There we go. This is a unique webinar in that it is co-sponsored by both Kiteworks as Coalfire, and we have two super smart folks on today's webinar, Mark and Danielle, and I'll introduce them here in a moment. But just as an introduction, as everyone knows, because you signed up for this, we're talking about CMMC and specifically honing in on some of the findings that we uncovered in a survey report that we published jointly with Coalfire a week or two ago. It has, if you've read the press release or actually read the report, and we are going to be sticking the link to the report landing page into the chat so you can click on it and take a look at it at your convenience. You will find that there's some really interesting data points contained within it. And we're going to include a discussion about recommendations and what you can do based on some of the findings at the end of today's webinar. So we include some practical outcomes for you. Before we get started, I want to introduce our two guests. I'm actually going to allow them to introduce themselves, but we have Danielle Barber, who is our Senior Director of Product Marketing, Regulatory Compliance, CCP, a bunch of other things that we could tie to her name. Danielle, you want to give an overview of your background to our audience? Some of them have probably seen you on videos and podcasts and some other things that you do.
Yeah, hi guys. I'm sure that you have. That's me that you're always seeing on your screen anytime I'm talking about compliance. Basically, my role here is to be the compliance and regulatory expert, whether that is local, regional, global, and being able to understand what those regulations are and how Kiteworks can help support you in being compliant. I've been here for almost 3 years and I've been with a couple of different startups, and it's really fun to be here with you guys today talking about CMMC. There's a lot going on.
I've done a couple webinars with Danielle over the past 3+ years, and it's always great to have her on a webinar because she has some great insights. So we have Mark Zerker joining us from Coalfire. He's the managing principal over there. Mark, you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure thing. Happy to do so. Thank you very much, Patrick, Danielle. I'm really excited to be talking with you all about CMMC today. Like Patrick said, my name's Mark Sersher. I'm a managing principal at Coalfire. I oversee our public sector advisory group. We specifically focus on FedRAMP, FISMA, CMMC, and the litany of other public sector compliance frameworks out there. I've been in the compliance space for a little over 10 years at this point, which really makes me feel old. Uh, but very excited to be chatting about CMMC and kind of charting the path and kind of what we see with the DIB today. So look forward to it.
Thanks to both of you for joining us today. We'll jump into it here in a second. As we can see, we'll start off briefly. Most in our audience know all about CMMC, but we'll just do a quick drive-by in terms of the timeline and the implementation of where we're headed right now and where we're at today. We'll look at the survey findings and industry insights that we called as a result of the survey that we ran. I think it was in February, so it wasn't too long ago. And then Danielle and I worked on the report. Danielle mostly did a fabulous job on it. If you've checked it out, it's laid out very nicely. It's about 30 pages. And then Mark reviewed it and provided insights. So it's definitely, if you're impacted by CMMC, it's something you need to have on your nightstand. And then we'll finish it up by talking a bit about action plans and recommendations from Mark's perspective as well as Danielle's perspective. And they both have very unique views, right? They come from different companies because of the focus areas of Coalfire and Kiteworks, and that will be, I think, valuable contribution for our audience. And we'll allow you to we'll allow you to input some Q&A, which you can do in the Zoom session here, and we'll try to cover some of those sessions at the end of today's webinar if we have time to do so. So let's take a look here. Danielle, do you want to talk through the 4 phases that we have mapped out here on this slide? Then Mark, I'll let you chime in on a couple. In fact, I have a question set aside for you specifically on this slide, but we'll start with Danielle.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Patrick. So before we kind of get into this timeline, I just want to refresh everyone's memory. 32 CFR Part 170, the final rule was published, is effective as of December 16th of last year. And so what that really did was that codified CMMC compliance requirements with the levels, with the controls, and means that your organizations can go out and start working on your CMMC certification. And that's where we are right now. That's where we see the beginning of phase one coming in. And phase one is going to begin 60 days after 48 CFR has been published. So 60 days after it's been published is when it is officially effective. And that is when some contracts, not all, but some contracts are going to be required to provide their level 1 self-attestation and or their level 2 assessment and therefore certification. Phase 2 is going to be 1 year after 48 is effective, and that is going to include some organizations that are going to need to have their level 2 certification. Again, not all. Then phase 3 is going to be 2 years after 48 CFR is effective, and this is going to require some level 3 certifications. Again, not all. Phase 4 is when we are going to see all of this come into fruition, and this is going to be 3 years after 48 CFR is effective, and that means that if you are going to have a contract with the DoD, that is the last chance. If you are not certified, you can't even bid on a contract. So while I do say some here, you heard me throughout, the assumption is you should assume, unless the DoD has contacted you directly and said, you do not need to worry about this right now. Assume that you are part of the masses that must be certified, that must be compliant. As I said, even though we have not officially started on phase 1 today, it is happening, it is coming. Just to give you a quick recap, if you have not seen Cyber AB, I would highly recommend checking out their website. I would recommend going to their town hall. As of their latest one on March 25th, we saw 64 C3PAOs that are now ready, that are now authorizing, that are now giving certifications. We saw 336 assessors. We saw 343 registered practitioner organizations, and these numbers are just expanding. So CMMC, this whole universe is growing. It is time. If you are still sitting back and going, I don't know if this is me yet. Nope. Time to get up, time to get moving. That's really what I'm trying to show you here with this information.
That's great. And I remember the last CMMC webinar, which we did, I don't know, it's been a year ago or so, I think, Danielle, if I remember correctly. The number of 3 CPAOs was much lower. It was half of what it is or less today, and it's growing exponentially because organizations need to get on board. So Mark, on that note, folks are getting on board, but I heard Danielle run through all that stuff. I thought, you need to have a lawyer to think through a lot of this stuff to make sure you're actually compliant and so forth, and who you need to talk to. There's this False Claims Act, which most in our audience have heard about. One, that's something you need to be aware of, number one, and number two, it seems to be time to get started. Waiting is not really an option at this juncture. That's my interpretation.
You are 100% correct, and I think Danielle hit the nail on the head. A lot of folks I've heard are kind of waiting around and seeing, well, let me see when 48 CFR gets finalized and when I actually have to meet the requirements in order to bid on contracts. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to this, realize that these requirements have been in place not just at the beginning of 32 CFR, which finalized the CMMC rules. These requirements have been in contracts for nearly a decade at this point. The requirements to protect CUI, or controlled unclassified information, that's been in place for a while now, since the 2010s, 2016 areas, when 800-171 was initially established and folks were being asked to self-attest to meeting those requirements. That has been there for long enough now that for folks who are maybe thinking that I've self-attested to this, I don't have to worry about it as much, it'll be an easy uplift. Patrick, you bring up the False Claims Act. This is where the big stick of CMMC comes into play. And I want to highlight a particular company that just got a settlement against them, Morse Corporation out of Massachusetts. They're a small defense contractor. They just got hit with a $4.6 million settlement for specifically failing to not comply with cybersecurity requirements, specifically around 800.171 and the CMMC requirements. They were not using FedRAMP equivalent or FedRAMP ATO services. They were not meeting the 800.171 requirements. They didn't have adequate system security planner documentation. And to cap it all off, they had fraudulent scores, fraudulent SPRS scores or SPRS scores, notating that they had a near perfect compliance score, when in reality, they had like a net negative compliance score. And for folks that are thinking, oh, well, you know, $4.6 million, yeah, that's a lot of money. But you know what? I've only been in this game for a short period of time. These claims and some of these offenses go all the way back to 2018. And so that's why I really want to try to reframe this conversation of folks thinking that CMMC is new and all of these requirements are new. No, these requirements have been in place for a very long time. You have just been self-attesting to them for a long time and haven't really been thinking about them to the level that you're going to need to. And I think we're really going to dive into a lot of the analysis around that and kind of, you know, why having a partner or having some help around these areas is crucial and important.
Absolutely. You need a partner to help guide you through that process. You know, speaking of FedRAMP High, Danielle, guess who just achieved FedRAMP High ready status? And guess who our auditor was as part of that process.
I wonder.
So let's dive into the survey. I will talk at a high level here, and then we'll go into some of the findings, and I'll allow Mark and Danielle to expound on those. But we surveyed 209 organizations. 32% of them were small, 48%, about half were medium, another 20% were large organizations. So it was a good sampling, a good mix of different organizational sizes. And from the perspective of who we surveyed, the personas, technical leadership, a little more than a third, about 20% were executive leaders, CEOs, COOs, CFOs, and so forth. Risk and compliance leaders, about a quarter, and about a quarter legal and other folks. So you can see that, you know, it was a nice sample size, and it was a sample size across different organizational sizes as well as individuals within those organizations. So let's start with, we picked out 3 or 4 of our key findings, and we'll drill down on each of them with Mark and Danielle. The first one relates to gap analysis impact. You can see that about 40% of organizations indicate they've done a gap analysis and it's complete. Another 41%, ironically, say it's in progress. It'll be done sometime this year, most likely. And then another quarter haven't even started. And those are the ones that need to get started right away. And we'll see why here in a moment. The gap analysis advantage for those organizations that have actually fall into that 41% that have completed. You can see some of the numbers when we did a cross analysis between the different questions in the survey. There's a 3 times higher rate of working with experienced partners for those that have completed a gap analysis. So when you use a partner like Coalfire, you're going to be more successful, and we're going to see some of the other findings that attest that. 2.6 times more likely to have fully documented policies in place. 1.8 times better implementation of encryption standards, which is critical. And then 2.2 times more likely to have a detailed set of POAMs in place. All right, let's dive into some of the findings here and get Mark's and Danielle's opinion. So Mark, what does a gap analysis against NIST actually involve? When we're looking at a gap analysis, I think that's important for our audience to understand is what does that actually entail?
Yeah, and that's a great first question. I think to help kind of frame that, a gap analysis first and foremost starts off with a comprehensive CUI boundary scoping engagement or workshop, really understanding what's in scope versus what's not. It's one of the areas that we often see folks struggle with the most is understanding what needs to meet CMMC requirements versus what doesn't. You know, is this server over here, this office over here, these laptops here, this cloud product I'm using over there. A lot of confusion in that space. Once we have a fundamental understanding and an agreement upon what the scope of the engagement is looking like as part of this workshop, we really want to dive into the second aspect of a gap analysis, and that's largely information gathering. We're spending a lot of time with the client gathering information around all the individual controls that the NIST 800-171 requirements are asking for, as well as the CMMC requirements on top of that. We're spending time working with clients to unravel some of that government ease, government speak that are the NIST controls. God love the folks at NIST, but oftentimes the way those controls are written are not always easy to understand for everyday folks, laymen such as myself, engineers, compliance team members, even executives and technical leads are not always going to really be able to understand what's being said or what's really being asked by them. It'll say something in a particular way, and you're like, well, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean I can meet it with X or with Y or maybe both? That's really what we help to uncover as part of the gap session. We also then help folks understand what potential remediation pathways they can take with how to meet some of those controls, and help them plan out what that's going to look like over the course of the next 6, 9, 12 months as they work towards becoming audit ready and ultimately passing an audit. And typically, we try to not make these gap sessions onerous for either the folks that are going to be involved from an interview perspective or from a request for information or RFI information gathering sessions. So we really do try to limit them to no more than 2 or 3 days of your time, so that you're not having to carve out whole weeks, if not months worth of time, trying to work with our consultants to understand what's going on with that process.
All right, Danielle. Mark has the audience talked into doing a gap analysis now because he defined the process, and it's not that darn painful. So is 2025 going to be the year where we finally begin to see some movement in the DIB in the direction of CMMC compliance? Is this the year, or are we going to have to wait another year?
I hope so. I'm crossing the fingers, I'm crossing the toes. As Mark said, I think that the initial hurdle is just finding an RPO or C3PAO. I feel like that's the really big hurdle that folks, that organizations are coming across is, oh gosh, let's just get it started. But then once it's started, I feel like that's where it's okay. I see the gaps. I can start filling them. I can start allocating resources. I can figure this out. It feels more manageable instead of this big, scary, unknown thing of we're just going to wait. So I think that hope, again, crossing all the things that it's going to happen. We are waiting for 48 CFR to be published. It's looking like they're talking like it's going to be sometime in Q2. So I know I'm checking that website. It feels like daily, religiously. And so the hope is that once that is published, that will be a bit of the stick that Mark was talking about earlier of, okay, nope, you really can't wait. You can't make those excuses anymore. It is more than past time, especially considering that this year so far, we've already seen, I think, at least 6 major cybersecurity attacks just in the US alone. There was one against Meta. There's been a couple against healthcare, one that involved malware. There was one even that affected the DoD, and hundreds of their credentials were stolen. So we're not seeing any slowdown in cyber attacks. We are seeing that you have to get started and you have to do this yesterday, if not, if not now. So like I said, cross all the things. Let's hope.
It's going to be a kick in the butt.
A big one, a
We hope
really
so.
big one.
I hope
Yeah.
so. Which is to everyone's benefit, because securing information at DoD is critically important, and that supply chain is a weak link, as we all know. We've seen the last Verizon data breach investigations report. This year's will be coming out in a couple of weeks, right before RSA. I'm curious to see if that number's gone up. It was like 68% up year over year. 15% of all data breaches were connected back to the supply chain, which is what one of the things that CMMC tries to address with all these different contractors out there. So let's jump over to the next slide. I had a question about experienced partners, Mark, but I think that's going to work well a little later in the discussion. We'll come back to that. When we look at this number and we examine, organizations that have a fully documented security processes and policies in place and so forth, about 60% said they have that today. About a third say it's partially documented, and some others, they don't know where they're at, so the 3%. And they probably are in trouble and they need to bring in an experienced partner tomorrow to work with them. Danielle, you see on the perception gap there, which is really interesting, right? Cybersecurity leaders report 54% full documentation versus 80% is reported by CEOs, which leads me to believe that 61%, probably not all 60% are really fully documented because of the discrepancies we saw between the different personas. Is that your sense that, this is maybe overly enthusiastic folks, overconfident folks when it comes to their documented processes?
That's my perception as well. I mean, there was that big cyber sheath report that came out a year and a half ago that said only 4% of the DIB was actually ready for certification. So the fact that in 12, 18 months, it jumps that much and now, the majority have full documentation, I do find it hard to believe, especially considering the perception gap. And just based on research that I've done and conversations that I've had, I find that there's four main reasons for that perception gap. Especially when it comes to the C-suite, there's a lot of overconfidence, there's a lot of optimism bias, there's a lot of, we can handle it, we can do this, this is something that's within our wheelhouse. For instance, I think I was seeing there was a report, I had it in my notes somewhere in here, something about, yes, that 42% of C-suite leaders feel that they can respond to cyber attacks within 3 days. But 18% of frontline managers actually feel the same way. So that just really reinforces that there is that bias of we can handle it, we're ready, we're prepared. Secondly, I do think that there is a lack of transparency and communication, and that can depend on a lot of things, the culture of the organization, the culture of just the management and the people that are reporting to them. Then I think that there's also misaligned priorities, that they're not really understanding what's the main priority for who and why. For instance, there's differing views on security integration. What does it actually take? A lot of C-suites believe that it's a simple plug and play where there's a lot of background that is going to have to happen. And then resource allocation challenges. I feel, again, in the research that I was doing, a lot of the C-suite does not really understand, does not really see the alert fatigue that their teams are seeing, a lot of the false positives that they're having to respond to, and just really that's being underestimated by the C-suite, again, due to either overconfidence or lack of transparency or communication. And then I do think that, again, the fourth is cultural and structural issues. I think that there is a big fear of accountability that can happen, especially if you have a smaller team where you can initially point to one issue or one team. No one really wants to raise their hand and say, I found this, or this is my fault, or we need to allocate more budget, or we need to get more team members on that. I think that can definitely keep some team members a little bit more quiet, and things are not bubbling up the way that they potentially should. So that's
Well, when we
really
look at
what I'm
that
seeing.
earlier slide, just building on what you said, Daniel, and that's great. You saw that, 40% say they've done a gap analysis, but then here you look at it and say 60% say they're fully documented. How do you know?
Right.
If only 40% have done a gap analysis, this is a great question for Mark, and 60% claim they're fully documented, they really don't know because they haven't done that gap analysis.
Exactly. And I mean, I'll even point back to kind of the survey Danielle was talking about, where 4% felt completely ready for CMMC. In that same survey, and I think Kiteworks also looked at this back in October, 40%, less than 40%, said that they're actively working on their documentation. And now you're going to tell me that almost 90% are actively working on your documentation? Something smells a little fishy there. I mean, I think this kind of goes back to my earlier point I made around defense industrial base organizations having had to self-attest to 800-171 requirements for years, some for nearly a decade, and never really being called on it. So there was never that accountability aspect, which is, hello, why CMMC kind of had to come into fruition. And I think that kind of leads to a false sense of security. So I don't necessarily think that anybody is actively trying to mislead, but you kept saying that, yes, we're doing this. Yes, we're doing this. Yes, we're doing this. You start to think, yeah, maybe I am actually doing it. When in reality, the frontline folks, they know what's actually not occurring. And I think going back to the survey participants, over half of these were executive leadership or technical leadership within these organizations. Only a quarter of them were kind of the risk compliance folks, the on-the-ground folks. I would be curious if there were more risk and compliance or on-the-ground folks, if some of these numbers would be significantly more negative than they already are.
Yeah, and I forgot if we looked at that in terms of cross analysis, but we could. That's a great point. Danielle, anything else strike you, that's not on this slide, but was sort of behind the scenes in terms of the cross analysis of the data that we did?
Oh gosh, so many things. I think so many things. I think
You
the
have four
biggest
things
one,
again?
I love my 3 and my 4. I love I love a bullet point. Makes me happy. I think that the biggest one though, because I realize that we don't have too much time, is that organizations that had minimal documentation were 30 times more likely to report inconsistencies just in their encryption. Just in their encryption. And encryption, if you're looking at NIST 800-171, that's relatively I don't want to say basic, but that's top of mind. That's something very kind of easy to just check mark that your CUI is encrypted. And to say that organizations that have minimal or no documentation are more than 30 times more likely to not have their CUI completely encrypted, to me was very shocking, because that just seemed like one thing that was very easy to just check mark off your list. And so yeah, for me that was a big, oh my gosh, that is a
One of those
flag.
things that should be a starting point. So if you don't have that right, then you don't have a lot of other things most likely right.
Yeah, you've got a
Uh,
lot of things to check on.
which, leads
Oh, yeah.
nicely into this slide here, right? We look at organizations that, from a documentation standpoint, that are fully documented. You can see where they're at when it comes to encryption standards, very high rate there. The third party controls in place, 3/4, 80 some percent for access management controls. But if they're partially documented when it comes to the security standards and policies, you're looking at, maybe half that have encryption standards that are up to snuff, third-party controls, access management, and then they have minimal documentation. It just falls off the face of the earth. If you're looking at the earth from a flat standpoint, you're sailing along. You're not in good shape. Mark, does security documentation, how does it translate into better security as well as compliance governance? Because you work with a lot of organizations, and you work with us, right, on SOC and ISO and FedRAMP for certifying and auditing our platforms. I suspect you see, once you get SOC in place, it's a lot easier for ISO. Once you have NIST 2 gap analysis done, it's going to be a lot easier for the subsequent certification you do, including CMMC.
Yeah, I think it honestly really comes down to your maturity level. Uh, I'm sure, like most of us, if you don't write it down, did it actually happen? Did you actually remember to do it? And security documentation acts in very much the same way. It really forces you to increase your maturity in any of the given processes by putting active thought into what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and with what support you're doing with that particular task. What tool am I using for this particular control area? What process am I putting in place here? What am I supposed to be following? And then it very nicely dovetails into making your entire audit and governance process easier, because it provides a backstop for you and the auditor to baseline kind of the evidence collection that you would require, and what you're going to then be held accountable to. It really links back to that understanding the full scope of what you're going to ultimately be audited against and have to prove that you are doing what you say you're doing and providing evidence behind that.
Interesting. Now, if organizations have great security documentation in place, Danielle, how does that translate into the technologies that they have, and how they vet those technologies, how they implement them, how they assess them? I assume there's a correlating factor associated with that process.
Definitely. I think that it's just straightforward. It's going to provide you that visibility. It's going to provide the visibility into, okay, yes, we can check this off. This has been done. No, there is a gap here. Having something like a customer responsibility matrix and being able to say who is handling what part of NIST 800-171, and being able to absolutely link it is going to not only help with understanding where the gaps are and filling them, but with compliance, because it's an organization can't just say, I'm compliant. Great, where's the proof? That's my son coming to me and saying, Mommy, I cleaned my room. But then I go in there and, oh, where's the proof? So that's really, I know I make it simple, I apologize, but that's what we're really looking for, is having that documentation, having that audit trail, and being able to look and point and say, this is what is in charge of it, this is what is managing it. We have checked these controls, we have checked this security on this date, this time, this is the access of who did what. Being able to point to it, that is going to really make sure that through this document maturity and being able to point to what we've done and what we still need. For instance, maybe there's a POAM that needs to happen, and being able to partner at that point with an RPO and say, we've already done our internal review, we've done our gap assessment, this is where we're having our gaps. Please come in, help verify, lend us a helping hand. That's going to make the process much easier, probably a little bit more affordable, and it's going to go a lot faster.
No, that's a great point. We're actually going to talk about how much you need to set aside when it comes to your CMMC audit. And we did ask a question around that a little later in today's webinar. Mark, one last thing on this slide. I mean, rarely do you ever get, when you do these surveys, zero, a big goose egg on one of these answers. And we did when it comes to minimal security documentation in place, when it comes to adhering to encryption standards, none of them actually do so. Why do you think that's the case? What's the linkage between the two?
Honestly, I found this interesting as well. I think this all goes back to the perception problem that Danielle highlighted earlier. If your executive leadership doesn't know or understand what's going on within your organization, and you don't have it documented somewhere, how are you going to be able to say that, yeah, I'm confident that I'm meeting these encryption requirements, or that these encryption standards are being met where I'm protecting CUI data? If you don't have that written down, it's going to be incredibly difficult to be able to confidently and honestly say that.
Yeah, yeah, great point. All right, let's go on to another data point that we called here when it comes to external partner engagement. And Mark, I'm sure is going to have something to say about this, and I'm actually going to just do a drive-by on this slide, and then we're going to dive into some details on the subsequent slide that where we did some actual cross analysis against this question. But we ask, when it comes to external expertise, are you working with partners? You saw that 45% are working with an experienced third party, and we'll ask Mark what qualifies as experience here in a moment. About a third say they're trying to vet them and find someone they can work with. They probably have looked at that roadmap and thought, uh-oh, I need to do something. I need to be prepared. And then you see that 21% said, we're not going to work with anyone outside our organization. We're going to do this in-house when it comes to compliance. Those are some interesting and maybe alarming numbers in some ways. When we look at the cross analysis here, those that work fully with partners are doing quite well when you look at the different security aspects and compliance aspects. So fully documented policies, 3/4 of them say they have those in place if they're working with an experienced third party. Well-defined scopes, over 60%. Verified encryption standards, over 80%. Formal vendor management, almost 3/4. And then those that are doing it in-house, these aren't real good numbers when you look at them. 43% for documented policies, 27% well-defined scopes, encryption, 6, they're doing a little better here, 6 out of 10, and then less than 40% for formal vendor engagement. You can see the percentages we added up there on the right-hand column. Mark, let's start with you here. Working with, well, maybe you can say and help us define what an experienced third party looks like. How do you find an experienced third party? There's a lot out there. It seems to make a difference when you work with one. Why is that the case? And, are there some things that you can take away from the cross analysis that we did here?
Yeah. The CMMC sea of partners is very wide. There are a lot of fish in that sea. And touching on the experienced part of it is incredibly important. There are a lot of folks that are getting into the C3PAO or the RPO game that are very new on the scene. A lot of small shops and a lot of folks that maybe not have the breadth and depth of experience that you would find from partners like Coalfire or other ones out there. So I really, really recommend to shop around when you're looking for partners. It's not necessarily always going to behoove you to go with the lowest bidder on some of these. That's where that experienced aspect comes into play. Folks that live and breathe this stuff. I'm sure most of the folks on this call are not sitting there like Danielle, constantly refreshing that page to see when that's going to be released. They're not living and breathing the DFARS regulations or keeping up with government audits or seeing what's happening day to day and changes within the federal government. Of course not. They've got day jobs to do, right? I mean, you've got a Microsoft 365 environment that you need to run. You've got vulnerability scans that you need to run. That's where the value of having an external experienced third-party partner come in to really help you through these processes. I mean, I love these slides, Patrick, because I love it when the data backs up what you're seeing on the ground. Every single category here, an almost 30% increase in compliance when you're working with a partner. And this all kind of goes back to that starting point of why conducting a gap with an experienced third party, an experienced partner is crucial to the process. Because if you don't know what your true CUI boundary is, how are you possibly expected to be able to protect it? Everything flows from there.
Great point. Another aspect that I found interesting on the slide, Danielle, was related to third-party risk management. You know, that last item around formal vendor management. There's, we do our annual survey. I think the last one had, I forgot the exact numbers, almost 2/3 of organizations indicate they work with over 1,000 third parties, and then over a third work with, I think it's over 2,500 third parties. They pose risk, right? Because one weak link in that third party supply chain and, a breach can happen. Data can escape, compliance violations take place. What's your perspective there? And, with Kiteworks, you're able to manage some of that process. You can maybe talk at a high level about, our next generation digital rights management and governance and tracking and control processes. But, what's your perspective?
Gosh, I think when it comes to third party, it's just the lack of control. It's just, okay, here's my CUI. And then it goes into the void. It's never, it may not be seen or heard from again. There's, with some of these other options, there's no way to track it. You don't know if they opened your email. You don't know if they downloaded it. Did they send it to just their supervisor? Did they send it to 20,000 people? I mean, there's a reason why some estimates say that shadow data within an organization, so data that they don't know that they have, they don't know that they are in control of it, accounts for up to 50% of their overall data. I mean, so there is a reason why these third parties can really be your absolute weakest link. This supply chain can really be where you're taking advantage of. And, we're seeing that with a lot of these cyber attacks. They're going through the cyber chain. They're going for the third party vendors because they maybe don't have the budget to be as fastidious when it comes to making sure that they're implementing their security controls. But it's really important in that same vein, as you said, Patrick, to go with the CSP that has a platform that can track, control, and protect all the data, whether it is sent to a third party or not. So that means that there's end-to-end encryption. There is email control. You can see who's opened the email. Did they download it? You can actually give them permissions. Are they only a viewer of this folder or this file? Are they a collaborator? Are they a manager? You can also put safe edit, which is a next gen DRM. You can say, okay, no one is allowed to download this. No one is allowed to do anything with it. They can see it. There's a watermark on there. So in case there's a screenshot taken, we know exactly who the link is. We know exactly where to go. But it is having that control over all of the CUI. And again, the guitar that I just keep, harping on is visibility, 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 is being able to look at your audit log and say, I know exactly when, where, by who this data was accessed. I know through version control, I can see all the versions. I know what was changed, where it was taken, etc. And it really makes it, one, so that you can prove your compliance that you're doing this. Congratulations. But two, so that you actually know what's happening. We were talking earlier about some of these attacks that have happened that have affected us personally. And it's being able to see exactly what data is accessed at exactly what time, and not just there was a whoopsie, but we don't know what was affected. And being able to point and having a CSP like Kiteworks, shameless plug, being able to say we know exactly what happened and where is really what's going to help get you to that next level.
Those are great points. Mark, when it comes to the NIST controls and gap analyses, using those allow you to take a holistic approach or provide holistic visibility across your entire environment. That's important for organizations. Many of these, unless you do a gap analysis, you actually can't really achieve that holistic visibility and a holistic approach to security and compliance.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it goes back to what Danielle was saying. Being able to, I like to frame it like being able to see the forest through the trees. Outsiders, trusted partners, we have the benefit of not being in your day-to-day environment and not getting lost in the day-to-day tasking you have, in the weeds, the internal politics, this BU is doing something over here, this BU is doing something over here, Margaret in accounting is doing something over there. We have the benefit of not being caught up in that and being able to provide that holistic overview of what's occurring. And then we can help to then provide the outside perspective that's going to help to tie security, compliance, and honestly, well, maybe the most important here, but the interests of the business together to ensure that you're successful. Because if you don't have the business's interest while talking about all of this is all going to fail. You're going to be spending a lot of money and a lot of time to do something that may not have a return on the investment that you're trying to put into it.
That's a great point. Yep, great point. Well, I really like this next slide. We combine two slides into one here. They both correlate with each other, but we ask organizations, what are your top CMMC challenges when it comes to getting compliant with CMMC and certified? Resource constraints was number one. That means they need an experienced third party to help them because they don't have the internal resources to do it, or they currently don't have the right third parties in place to make this happen. Technical complexity was a close second. Scope and requirements, little less than a quarter, and then executive buy-in doesn't seem to be a huge issue for most organizations at 11%. And then when you look at the variation of challenges between organizational size, it was interesting. Not a big surprise here. Over half of small organizations, which are going to have fewer resources, said resource constraints is our number one problem. Medium-sized organizations, about 40% said technical complexity was an issue for them. We're going to talk about technical complexity here in a moment. In large organizations, scope, complexity were cited. So, Mark, let's start with you. When Coalfire meets with clients, are resource constraints at the very top of the list typically with the organizations you're working with?
It usually is. This survey kind of lines right up with what we're seeing in the field, and I'll add a little bit of context. So the word resource, I find interesting because the way I look at it is there's two types of resources. There's like the personnel and time resource, and then there's kind of the dollar resource. And I find that a lot of smaller organizations, they struggle in both of those categories. They just don't have the teams or the people power or the time to kind of take away from the day jobs to do a lot of these security measures and these security requirements. I think somebody just asked in the chat a question around, hey, like, I don't got the budget to do these things. How am I supposed to even attempt to manage to do boundary scoping or a gap without the budget? And that kind of goes to the other resource constraint that I see a lot of smaller organizations having is they'd have not set aside the dollar amounts that they need in order to do a lot of these security upgrades in a very short period of time. And that's particularly why working with trusted partners can be incredibly helpful, whether it's just in getting advice on how to go about doing things, or whether you start looking at managed CUI enclaves and environments to help save you on that time or the personnel for smaller organizations if you're trying to meet those requirements. Again, just being able to budget out and I'll say sometimes the misaligned perception that because they're already self-attesting to a lot of these requirements, they're not thinking that there's a big gap in what they're doing versus where they need to be. And that's really part of the reality that's not coming out to play here.
Yeah, and great pickup on that question that popped in from our audience. Mark is very adept at multitasking, obviously. So thanks, Mark.
The ADHD coming into play.
Danielle, do you have any thoughts around technical complexity? It wasn't at the top of the list for most organizations. For medium-sized organizations, it was. You spoke a bit about Kiteworks, but finding tools like Kiteworks that simplify the complexity of achieving CMMC compliance or other types of compliance that you're trying to achieve, or demonstrating that you were compliant with GDPR or HIPAA and so forth at the end of the year. That's really important as well.
100%. And, you know, to Mark's point, I really do think that technical complexity and resource constraints are very similar. I think they're very closely tied. You know, if you don't have the budget to upgrade your tools, to perform your regular audits, to hire more staff, you're going to have technical complexity gaps. You're going to have gaps there. And, you know, very similar to, you know, I think Roosevelt had asked the question earlier if there's any changes in current government as far as CMMC. Well, we're not seeing anything really coming out from the current administration with changes to CMMC. What we are seeing is, and this answers maybe perhaps David's question that came up, more of the budget constraints. So there was an act that was introduced last year for small businesses to help give them some extra funds, some discounts. And now with some of these freezes, it looks like that's going to be cut as well. So there are some of these impacts that we are seeing for these small and medium businesses that are budgetary,
That are
but are
indirect
going to
impacts. Yeah.
exactly, they're going to have technical complexity impacts as well. And you know, I think that that also feeds back into the things that we've already talked about, the bias in the C-suite, maybe the not understanding what's going on a little bit lower because everyone says it's okay, we're working on it, and then they take that as it's okay, we're ready. And then there's also, again, the visibility into all data, like I said, the shadow data, and just not really being able to pinpoint and say, we don't know where it is, we don't know it exists, maybe they don't know it exists, you don't know what you don't know. And so I think that's also a factor of it as well.
Well, and back to, as the current administration, have changes in regards to CMMC. It seems that Katie Arrington, who is the CISO and is the acting CIO over at the Department of Defense, she has a keen interest in seeing CMMC come to fruition. So I don't see that anyone's going to back off of it. It's going to continue to be a focus. In fact, our report was cited in a article in Defense Scoop earlier this week, I believe it was, or late last week, that talked about that very issue, and the report was used as corroboration that there's going to be a continued focus on ensuring that the supply chain and sensitive data within the DoD remains private and doesn't leak and is compliant with the regulations out there in the marketplace. So let's see. I promised everyone we'd talk a bit about cost. So organizations are probably asking, well, how much is it going to cost me to demonstrate and achieve CMMC compliance? We asked, we gave them a couple different buckets, and you can see how it landed. About a third, a little more than a third of, or right at a third of organizations said between $50,000 and $100,000. A quarter said over $100,000, and under $50,000 was almost half, not quite. Mark, from your vantage point, are organizations setting aside enough money? Of course, it depends on organization size and their maturity from a security standpoint. Is this enough? They need to set aside more?
Yeah, so I mean, real talk, I think based on what we're seeing on this slide, I think a lot of leaders need to have a long, hard look at their business case and the requirements for CMMC and really get a keen understanding of the breakdown and what the costs associated are going to be. The fact that almost half only budgeted about 50,000 or less shows me that there is a direct misalignment with what is required versus what their budgeting expectations are. It kind of goes back to what Danielle was talking about. Some of the items and like the cost to consider are not just the audit and 50K might cover the completion of the audit, but it doesn't cover any additional headcount you might have to bring on, any net new licensing costs for, let's say, a FedRAMP equivalent or FedRAMP authorized cloud product that maybe you're not using now and you now have to switch to. If you're going to use a trusted advisor, like we talked about, that's a huge boost to being able to pass an assessment. And if you're not going to use an advisor, all of the time and resources that are spent doing CMMC or compliance requirements, where folks are not doing their day-to-day jobs, making your organization money. Those are all things that really need to be taken into account when you're considering the expected investment and budget. And finally, there's the cost of the False Claims Act settlement. I'm sure most of these organizations, if you're only setting aside $50,000, you do not have $4.6 million to set aside for a settlement in which you've claimed to be meeting cybersecurity requirements that you're not. And I guess real quick, Patrick, to your point earlier about that Defense Scoop article, a lot of people saw that and either got really, really excited or really, really scared because they saw the word that the CMMC program was going to be reviewed. And they thought, ooh, maybe that means it's going to go away. And I just want to address that if you read the article and you read the testimony that was given, it was made very clear that this program is not going away.
Not going away. It's
If
staying.
anything, they are looking at how to potentially improve it, or to your point earlier about how we can get some more money for small businesses or how to lessen the impact. Those are the areas that they're looking to review, but do not expect or anticipate that CMMC is going anywhere.
I
They've
agree
spent
100%.
10
Yep.
years allowing folks to self-attest, and that's why we are here where we are now.
Yeah. Great point.
Sorry, I'll get off
So
my
if you
soapbox.
you need to go back and evaluate your budget if you've allocated less than 50,000 because you probably don't have enough in there, and it's part of the cost of doing business. It's part of your business strategy. It's not just a checklist item. To Mark's earlier points. All right, so everyone's wondering, well, what do I do with all these findings? There are more than just these findings in the report, so I encourage you to grab that link that we put into chat and take a look at it at your leisure. But we have 5 takeaways here on our slide, and I'll just let Mark and Danielle go through each of these and provide their perspective. We have a little bit of time. We want to do relatively rapid fire through these so we can get to any Q&A that has cropped up from our audience. We've already covered one question. There's 1 or 2 more that have popped in here. But Mark, point 1, talk a bit about it.
Definitely. Conducting a gap is the first step through the door. It's going to help you understand your full scope. It's going to help you understand where your delta from where you are to where your need is going to be. And it's honestly going to help you really understand what your business case and your ROI is potentially going to look like and whether this makes sense for you to continue to go down. Highly recommend starting with the gap, as you see here, 3 times more likely to have strong controls by the end of the process.
Great point. Danielle, point 2.
It's really self-explanatory. If you develop the documentation and the policies around your cybersecurity for your organization, you are going to, based on our report, have a 70% higher security implementation rate. So just taking that one big step of saying, okay, yeah, it's writing the policies, it's writing the documentation. It may not be the most exciting thing. I totally get it. But being able to just put that to paper and saying, this is how we're going to handle it. Now, everyone, please go ahead and sign and say that you're going to do it and start implementing it is going to make you that much more successful when it comes to implementing these security controls.
Yeah, it's just not CMMC. The earlier point that I made, I think it was in the press release we did a year or 2 ago about our FedRAMP or SOC compliance, because we have a lot of security processes in place. It's fully documented, and we've done year after year these different security certifications, or there's a couple that are every other year. It makes it immensely easier each time we tackle a new one. From a Kiteworks perspective, and those that are in the DIB are going to have the same experience. So, you get your house in order, you clean your room, as Danielle tells her son, it's going to make it a lot easier down the road. You're going to be able to eat dinner, and you're going to get a treat afterwards.
Oh,
so, Mark,
treat.
point number 3, what's your perspective there?
Definitely. Danielle, are you telling me you don't enjoy writing system security plans? I mean, my heart breaketh. My heart breaketh.
I'm so sorry to disappoint you.
Creating a detailed plan of action and milestones dovetails incredibly nicely with having fully documented cybersecurity policies. If you're not able to write down and understand what gaps you have that need to be remediated and you can't track those over some time of plan of action and milestones, you're going to end up missing something. Ensuring that you have structured POAMs is going to get you across the finish line in a much more compliant manner than if you're just shooting from the hip. 64% better progress across all of these various controls. Even if you can't take those POAMs on through the audit, this is an excellent way of tracking everything that comes out of the gap and seeing them to completion end.
Yeah, great point. All right, Danielle, you're up next.
Last one. So this is a little bit of what I've been talking about earlier with that shadow data, but nearly 30% of the organizations that do not have visibility, into their CUI just don't have visibility into third-party access of it. And so that really goes into, you have to establish strong governance and access controls early on. That means making sure that people have the right roles set up. And then if you need to go granular, going into file, going into folder, but really just making sure that as people are onboarded, okay, they are a manager level, they've got this access. And then as they are offboarded, okay, they are removed. That's really all it is. It's just making sure that from the absolute get-go, we are establishing these strong governance controls over absolutely all of the CUI.
That's great. Mark, last but not least here on our list of 5.
Yeah, definitely a bit of a shameless plug here, but I can't harp this enough. Engaging with an experienced partner is really going to help you get across the finish line, not just in the timelines that you're looking for, but helping you within the budget allocations that you do have set aside. It's going to help make sure that your documentation is better. It's going to help make sure that you understand what you're going to get audited against, and it's going to help you ensure that you're continuing to be able to do your day-to-day job and continue making money for your organization. As you see there, big jump from 43 to 76% versus doing something in-house and having an experienced partner help you throughout that process.
Yeah, very, very true. All right, so Danielle, just quickly, we've talked about Kiteworks and some of the capabilities we have. I think this was done, Bob and I did this before you came on board. This has been like 3.5 years ago, and then you've improved it dramatically and reassessed it periodically. But if you use Kiteworks, it makes it a lot easier and faster for you to achieve CMMC compliance. Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. And as you said, this was a wonderful asset that you and Bob created before I even joined. And this is actually for the FedRAMP moderate authorized deployment with the Kiteworks Federal Cloud offering. So this does not include what you had said earlier with our FedRAMP High Ready product, the Kiteworks Secure Gov Cloud. But the really great thing that I just want to highlight here is this is showing that Kiteworks can support nearly 90% of level 2 requirements out of the box. Just ready, here we go. We're a partner. We're going to go ahead and not just say we can check the box, but this is a true partnership of, really making sure that things like access control, identification, authentication, system and communications protection. Kiteworks offers a really fabulous platform that helps you track, protect, and control your data. That's the shameless plug I just want to say is that, those are the main tenets of where we stand, of how we can help you out. There are some that are shared responsibility. There are some that are going to be out of scope, like physical data, actual printouts of things. That's not something we can help with. But, overall, I just want to once again say that if you're going to go with a equivalent vendor, based on the DFARS, what is it, 252.204-712, there are 3 main components that really have to be done to make sure that an organization is actually equivalent to FedRAMP. If you're not going to go with Kiteworks, please go with the CSP that is FedRAMP moderate authorized. Please make sure that you are doing that, because if you go for an equivalent and they are not equivalent, you are on the hook.
You may be
and
redoing it and buying another technology 6 months down the road.
Exactly.
So,
You
yes.
don't want to do it.
So check out the guide. If you don't believe that one slide, there's a guide on the report landing page that goes into detail in regards to all the data we have on that site. So Mark, you guys do a lot of assessments, just not CMMC, obviously. Can you talk a bit about Coalfire and everything you guys do?
Yeah, very much can. Coalfire is an industry-leading cybersecurity consulting firm, and we have a breadth and depth of various different services that we can help clients with. Primarily, we want to be your cybersecurity trusted advisor. We excel in advisory in terms of FedRAMP, CMMC, commercial compliance frameworks, everything from ISO, SOC, HITRUST. If you have a compliance framework that you need help with, I can almost guarantee you that Coalfire can help you get there from 0 to audit ready and to pass that audit. If you've already gotten that help, We have teams that can assess and audit those very same systems in the very same certifications and fields and areas, just like we've helped Kiteworks with their FedRAMP audit. We also have a robust cybersecurity practice that focuses on penetration testing, red teaming, bug hunting, vulnerability management, cybersecurity program build out, you name it, they do it. We also have another robust federal practice that if you have cleared work, if you have government contract work, if you need a CMMC C3PAO, which we also offer, all of those areas and more is how Coalfire can help you on your cybersecurity journey.
What does Coalfire not do?
What do we
You
not
guys
do?
do just about everything.
We cannot
And
audit
we
your
can
taxes.
attest, you know, it's a great partnership we've had with you and working through some of our certifications here. You know, if you need help, Coalfire is a great place to go. In terms of resources, we have them here on the slide. You know, there's a DoD CMMC compliance office. I think we may have stuck that in the chat. NIST 800-171 publication. You know, Kiteworks has a couple links here. We have a, you know, our FedRAMP page goes into detail in terms of what capabilities we have around FedRAMP. As Danielle noted, we're now FedRAMP high ready. We've been FedRAMP moderate for, I think, since 2017. And then if you are interested in some of Coalfire's advisory assessment services, there's 2 links I included on the bottom of that site. So if folks want to get in touch with you over at Coalfire, Mark, what's the best way to do so?
Best way is either reach out to me or on LinkedIn or shoot me an email. You can use my first dot last name at coalfire.com. I'd be happy to reach out to you, talk to you about any of the Coalfire services we might have. Or if you just want to chat compliance, you can hit me up on LinkedIn.
That's great. Danielle, I assume the same for you?
100% ditto.
Well, we're not going to have time to cover any Q&A. We did cover some of it, and I think in the chat, Lena was able to cover some of the questions that came up. We know you are very, very busy, and we appreciate the time that you took out of your day to attend today's webinar. We hope we were able to provide you with some great data points and insights and recommendations, and we look forward to having you join the next Kiteworks webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.